This is a better agreement than the one signed in September in Cartagena. So what we'll do now is see how to implement it as soon as possible.
De la implementación de un acuerdo de este tipo en cualquier democracia es el Congreso de la República, porque
for this kind of agreement is the Congress,
aprueba las reformas
country's Congress, because it's Congress that approves any constitutional reforms that are required to implement an agreement. And most political parties are willing to discuss and promote this agreement. So we're still conducting the talks in order to explain that most concerns of those who voted for no have been taken into account, have been introduced in the new agreement, because, well, we received more than 500 proposals of different kind. We analyzed them and put them together in 57 issues, and we negotiated 56 substantial changes in the agreement signed. So we have a new and better agreement. And of course, this is something very important for our country. Yesterday, I was in Washington at the OAS receiving support of each and every member of the OAS in order to implement this agreement as soon as possible. We received Europe's support. Europe supports us fully. The Prime Minister of Japan, with whom I met an hour ago, is giving us all his support. And I'm sure that China and Russia, who have been supporting us enormously in the Security Council, will continue giving us their support. So that is a clear front for Colombia, and that is very important for us, for our country and for the region. Peace in Colombia has regional implications, and this is good news for all of us, for all entrepreneurs, because this is the last armed conflict we have in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere. And if we manage to put an end to this last armed conflict, then we will have a peaceful continent in a world that unfortunately is still having many wars.
Y ese es el... Y creo que ahí termino porque se me acabó el tiempo.
I think this
Muchas gracias a ustedes
I'm out of time. Thank you very much for your
atención.
kind attention.
Ladies and gentlemen, please, another round of applause for President Santos, and also on behalf of the APEC CO7, President Santos, a very warm congratulations for winning the Nobel Peace Prize. Congratulations. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. We are about to begin our next session, which is going to be on the geopolitics of the region. And for those of you that are not familiar with Ian Bremmer, you are in for a real treat, because Ian Bremmer will be able to distill what really is going on in the world, given the recent developments. I would encourage you to look up Ian Bremmer's Twitter site and Facebook postings. He has a lot to say on the geopolitics of the region. And he's also going to take a few questions in this session as well. So please do give some thought about your questions that he can answer. The microphones will be available around the room. So sit tight. We'll be right back in about 2 minutes' time. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please give a very warm welcome to Mr. Ian Bremmer, the President of Eurasia Group.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be addressing you. And my warm appreciation to President Kaczynski for inviting me here today. A lot of you know that originally I was going to talk right in front of President Obama. And that does raise a question for me. What do you do when you think the leader of the world is going to be there and suddenly isn't? Now, to be fair, that's not really just a question for me. That's really a question for all of us, and not just for today. I'm here to address the big elephant in the room, which is the geopolitical environment, which is changing dramatically and in front of our eyes. We all know that economic recessions Let's be clear. The United States, my country, remains the world's only superpower. It's true if you look at the size of the military. Those are great neighbors. Turkey would love neighbors like that, right? But America's role in the world is changing in front of our eyes. The good news about being the world's only superpower is that other countries cannot damage you anywhere near as much as you can damage yourself. That's also the bad news. Now, we've seen this happen twice since the collapse of the Soviet Union. First, we saw it after 9/11. The extraordinary overreaction of the United States to 9/11. The never-ending wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, incredibly expensive in lives and in resources, and ultimately ending in failure. That led to a serious credibility problem for the United States in the region and more broadly. But it also led Americans to question how much they wanted to be the world's policeman. It's happened again with the never-ending election of 2016. Incredibly expensive, incredibly negative and damaging. No one that looks at the United States as a beacon of hope and representative democracy can express any pride in what they've seen in the United States in the last 18 months. And not only has this election made allies around the world question the role of the United States, but we also see Americans questioning itself. Does the United States wish to be the architect of global trade? I ask you, the TPP, the TTIP, NAFTA. Does the United States want even to be the cheerleader for global values? Now, I want to be clear. I haven't yet mentioned Trump's name. Well, now I have. But even before we get to President Trump, this was an issue. Anyone that has traveled around the world and spoken with the foreign ministers and heads of state of America's allies here in Latin America, or Canada, or Europe, or the Middle East, or Asia, all of us heard the same thing. Are you committed to us? Do we need to hedge? Who's leading? How much can we count on the United States of America? We were already moving away from a Pax Americana. We saw it. We saw the Middle East in free fall. We've seen the failed states in Iraq and Syria, in Libya, in Yemen, in Afghanistan. We've seen the emergence of the world's most powerful terrorist organization. We've seen more refugees in the Middle East and Europe than the world has seen since World War II. The United States has largely been a bystander to that process. We have seen Europe with an identity crisis. Fundamentally, we're now asking questions about, does Europe have a future? The Brexit, the challenges of the rise of populism in all of the European countries, even in Germany, the weakness of Angela Merkel, the Italian referendum, the French elections, the Dutch elections. I can keep going. The transatlantic relationship, which has been the singular most important in underlying international architecture for the past generations, is now at its weakest point. Now, I don't want to pretend that there's no one that's leading anymore. That's not true. APEC's largest delegation, China. Saw Xi Jinping here earlier today. A lot of applause. More than I'm getting. Where the hell's my delegation? Right? I got to bring 300 people with me everywhere I go. I'd get more applause. It's true. Trump will do that. But you know you're coming. That's right. It's the new Trump delegation. Thank you. Thank you. Got to plant more people. Now, the point is the Chinese clearly are developing economic architecture. I was with a Singaporean prime minister a couple weeks ago before the U.S. election. And he said, where are you, America? He said, when China travels around, they have lollipops in their pockets. Just like your dentist used to, right? Right? They know what an emollient is. You want to pay for play? They're going to put money in. Peru, right here. Infrastructure, investment, trade, they get it. Where's the United States on these issues? The Chinese absolutely are playing a greater role economically. But those relations are largely bilateral. They are generally not transparent, right? And they are not on the military side. They're not on the diplomatic side, right? I mean, no one is going to play that role that the United States has played. China is becoming a more responsible stakeholder to help build infrastructure around the world economically, and that's great. Ask any country getting those checks, it matters. But is that going to come close to what happens when Obama's not on this stage? The answer is no. Russia is playing a greater role, specifically on security. Now, Russia as a country, you could argue elements are in decline. Certainly, if you look at their economy, where it is today compared to 20 years ago, foreign direct investment, lack of attraction, what's happened to their educational system, their culture, a lot of things that are hard. But the Russian military is strong. Putin is strong. And Russia's willingness to play a role in what they consider to be their backyard, which is larger than what many of the rest of us consider to be their backyard, is significant. So I am not suggesting that the United States plays a lesser role and there's nothing. What I'm trying to suggest is that the United States is not in any way going to be replaced. This is a much lower set of common denominators. Now, while this was coming anyway, here's where the U.S. election matters. I would honestly argue, and I suspect many of you would as well, that the Pax Americana is 1945 to 2016. You want to call it last week, that's fine. If you'd like to make it this speech, that's even better. But the fact is, in 2017, we start in earnest the G0. It's an absence of global leadership. And we don't yet know what comes after. But what we do know is that the support for these multilateral institutions is going to diminish. And while this had been incremental, so the likelihood, if, say, Clinton had won the presidency, or anyone else on the Democratic or Republican side, the likelihood is, while it would have continued, the U.S. would have played a greater role at the table to determine what comes after. Where I believe that with a Trump presidency, it is much more likely that we will see the G0 emerge as a reaction to that, and other countries developing their own ideas. So a TPP without the United States. A number of countries with their own military orientation. So what's going to happen post-Trump? And I will be the first to admit there's a lot of uncertainty coming out of the U.S. that you didn't have to deal with before. And it's not all downside. Certainly, if you look at the U.S. economy, and you look at some of those that have advised Trump, you can see infrastructure spending domestically in a low-interest environment. You could absolutely see less regulation in the banking sector and for a number of industrial sectors. You can easily see lower and simplified taxes. We have a Republican House and Senate. There is the potential for a good news story at home. They could also fail. It's uncertain. But I wouldn't write them off at all. I would not write off the U.S. market. I would not suggest that the United States is suddenly in decline because of Trump. I would not. But on foreign policy, life is going to look very different. And I want to go around the world for a few moments to give you a sense of what I mean. Let's start with where Trump can score some points. Russia. Now, I would argue that Obama's greatest failed policy was Russia. The United States said Assad must go. 5.5 years of war later, Assad not going anywhere. The United States said Russia must leave Ukraine. Last I checked, they are still there. U.S. put sanctions on the Russians. A lot of the Europeans don't like them. Chinese ignore them. U.S. does nothing. Now, I don't think that was what Obama had in mind when he put those policies in place. So I argue that fails. Now, Trump's perspective is, I can get a deal done. Trump is not an isolationist. America First is not isolationist. In fact, it's quite interventionist. But it is not multilateral. Obama more risk-averse, leading from behind. But when he led, when he intervened, he wanted to work with other countries. Trump, very interventionist, but a narrow definition of what the U.S. national interest is, much more unilateralist. Like in business, he views alliances as transactions. It does not matter if you are democratic or authoritarian. It does not matter if you are free market or state capitalist. If he can get a deal done with you, he will. He is the antithesis of American exceptionalism. In fact, he would say, look at the hypocrisy in the U.S. system. How can we tell them how to run their system when we're not even doing it ourselves? So let's get deals done. I could easily see with Russia, and he's already made these statements. He said Crimea was basically Russian before. There's now. He said no Russians in southeast Ukraine. He said, let's change the Republican platform, no arms for Ukraine. He said we're concerned about ISIS, not Assad. Really easy to work with the Russians and say, hey, you help us with ISIS. We recognize that what we said about Assad was not our problem. And sanctions get rolled back. maybe they even throw Snowden to the United States as a sweetener, right? That's a deal. Here's the issue. The Europeans have a real problem with these things. There's no question that if you are Poland or the Baltic states, you are going to find a Trump policy towards Russia deeply unnerving to you and your security. If you are other European states that have enjoyed the public good of NATO security provided by the U.S., but you don't want to spend any more on your defense because your economy is not doing well and it's deeply unpopular, well, NATO is about to become less important. Let's also keep in mind that Nigel Farage of UKIP was actively campaigning for Trump in the U.S. Geert Wilders of the Dutch Freedom Party went to Cleveland for the Republican National Convention to applaud Trump, and on his website today you can see "Make the Netherlands Great Again." I don't know what the initial greatness referred to, but let us assume, no, that's not nice. They had an empire too, it's just small. The point is that if you are a European leader, Trump is supporting right-wing populists that unnerve you. So both for domestic reasons and for international reasons, the transatlantic relationship is truly going to unwind under a Trump presidency. Now, in Asia, it's actually very different. Think about what just happened a day ago. Prime Minister Abe, much to the consternation of still American President Obama, gets on a plane, travels to Trump Tower, and spends 90 minutes mano a mano building trust with soon-to-be President Trump. And that works despite the fact that Trump has thrown the TPP under the bus, which Prime Minister Abe was considered his top priority with the U.S. for how many years? But I actually think this is going to work. And it's going to work for a few reasons. Where's the populism in Japan? What does Abe have to worry about? The population is shrinking, right? So as a consequence, middle class not eroding, per capita income's going up. There's no immigration in Japan. You don't have identity politics that are toxic the way you do across Europe with the refugees and the rest. So if you want to work with Japan, you've got the LDP or the LDP, right? And furthermore, Abe wants to build his military. Furthermore, Abe wants to change his constitution. Abe is really concerned about North Korea. If you talk to the Trump team, their biggest concerns, terrorism number one, nuclear proliferation number two. North Korea right on top of that list. Concerns that Trump has about China, on stealing IP, on industrial espionage, on currency, right there with the Japanese. So and finally, Abe just invited Putin to come to Tokyo, try to get a deal done on the Northern Territories. If I were advising Abe today, I would say, absolutely, tell Mr. Trump, you are so awesome diplomatically. If you could just help me with Putin make this deal happen, you'd be a real statesman. I would really appreciate that. That would make a difference. Trump loves that. You can put your name on the deal, right? Love that. That'd be awesome. So, frankly, I think that Japan, U.S. will be fine. I think South Korea, leaving aside President Park's problems right now, but structurally, same orientation. North Korea, still a very big problem. Security is a big part of this, right? Southeast Asia, not so much. Those countries just swing to China. We saw it with the Philippines. We're seeing it with Malaysia. We'll see it with Thailand across the board. Those countries like, you know what? China's writing the big checks. If you're going to make a bet, if you're in Southeast Asia and you want to make a bet on the future, China is a safer bet. Well, if you're going to bet on China, the only question is, do you capitulate now or later? Now looks good. Because if you wait till later, you're not going to get anything for it. Right? If you're the Philippines, if you're President Duterte and you say, I am the first one in line, and I'm your buddy, and I'm not going to work with the U.S. I don't like this military relationship. I know it unsettles you, China. I'm not going to see other countries, right? Well, you can get a lot more money that way. It sounds pretty good. So I think Southeast Asia sees that swing. The question will be in Asia, what's the security relationship, right? U.S. versus China, especially with the concerns around North Korea, harder to manage. Henry Kissinger, as the key senior advisor to Trump that we all respect, his biggest concern, U.S. and China kind of inexorably going to be more in conflict, realpolitik. You see those strains when you talk to the Trump team. So I would be more worried about U.S.-China going forward. But, you know, what's so interesting to me about speaking at this conference 10 years ago, how the Americans go to Beijing and they said, China, we want you to be the responsible stakeholders. We're doing all this lifting. You guys are becoming so much bigger. You got to take more leadership. I'm going to Beijing tonight. I got to tell you, I'm expecting they're going to tell me, hey, America, we need you to be more responsible stakeholders. There's some irony in that, but there's also, like any good irony, a little bit of truth. Final points, Latin America, Middle East. Latin America can't be a bad story, right? Why? At the end of the day, even if the U.S. is saying they're opposed on trade, even if the U.S. isn't going to spend as much time here, this is the part of the world where benign neglect is not a disaster. The countries are stable. There's no big geopolitical or military conflict. Even in Colombia now moving in the right way. Venezuela is the singular kind of disaster, long-term implosion. But generally speaking, right, it's like the United States doesn't need to actively do the next 5 things on your list or you're writing them off. And soft power in this part of the world, Miami is the capital of Latin America, interest in real estate, sending your kids to universities, all of that, that matters. So if you had 4 or even 8 years, you know, of Trump administrations, but they don't actively blow up relations in this part of the world, I suspect we'll still be okay. Now look at the exact opposite of that, the Middle East, where even if the U.S. was active, even if you put in Hillary Clinton, who wanted to do more, she was the hawk on Libya, the hawk on Syria, the hawk on Iraq. How much can Hillary do? How much could anyone do in the Middle East? Energy prices coming down with the revolution, right? If you're the Saudis and your legitimacy comes from oil so that you can write checks to keep your people happy, and just 3 weeks ago, for the first time in history, they make wide cuts in what they pay the entire public sector, how's that going to work for you? Got to worry about that. How is it going to work for U.S. relations in the Middle East when you're not only not scared anymore to say radical Islam, you're saying Islam. You're saying Muslims from troubled countries can't come to the U.S. anymore. When you have a problem with legitimacy at home, those leaders are going to have a really hard time saying we want to work more closely with Trump. That's going to hurt them domestically. So I think the Gulf Arab states get weaker, the relations get weaker. Iran does not suddenly become a friend. There's big questions about the sustainability of that deal. If you made me bet, I think it'll stay in place because it was a multilateral deal. The U.S. can't get rid of it by itself, but the relations are still going to be tense. So in the Middle East, you've got the Emirates. It looks like Singapore. Everyone goes there. Everyone transits. It's not all energy. That's okay. Israel, great relationship with Trump, great security, lots of technology, doesn't need Palestinian labor anymore. That's okay. Kurds in the north of Iraq end up fine. That's about it. So I'm giving you this little, I only have half an hour, right? Hard to do the whole world in half an hour. But, you know, not just watching the stage, but I've been talking to the delegates over the last day, and I've heard your concerns. People on the stage aren't talking about Trump and U.S. foreign policy. You all are. And I wanted to give voice to that. I wanted to give voice because this is a dramatic change. All of the geopolitical relations that you thought were stable are suddenly in play. But I do want to leave you, before we go to questions, with one upbeat message, right? And that is the urgency is there. That is that in the last 20 years, we as human beings have taken 1 billion people out of poverty. That is the most extraordinary accomplishment that the entire humanity has ever done
in our short history on this planet. If we want to, the resources are there to make a difference. If we want to, we do not have to give up on the benefits of globalization. We certainly do not descend into war. The danger here is not war, it's indifference and apathy and no values from your leaders and a lack of legitimacy and people not caring about growing inequality. Over the next 5 years, that's the danger. It's not that the US and China and Russia are suddenly going to be pointing their rockets at each other and we've got to hide in bunkers. But I truly believe the very fact that you have me addressing you today says that there are a lot of people here and a lot of people out there that want to take this on. So I hope you found this presentation even a little worthwhile. I apologize that it's me instead of Obama, but at the end of the day, yes, I'll take a couple questions. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian Bremmer. That was a wonderful address. As Ian mentioned, we do have some time for questions. So if you'd like to raise your hand, microphones are available around the room. Please introduce yourself and ask your question. Can I see a show of hands for some questions, please? I have a gentleman at the front here.
Liu Dongguang from Taiwan. You make some very, very interesting, polarizing remarks. One of the things I was curious about is, with the U.S. election, whether it's right or wrong, the electoral vote decided who became president, although the popular vote is different. I was curious as to what is your perspective, whether it should stay that way, or maybe the popular vote should decide.
Look, I'm not a fan of the Electoral College. I'm not a fan of $2 billion being spent on the election. I'm not a fan of 18 months being taken to do election. We've got to get ready for one in another year, basically, in the U.S. These things are all broken. But I'll tell you what worries me more. What worries me more is this is the single most important election of my lifetime, and only 55% of Americans could bother to vote. The strongest feeling in the United States is not pro-Trump, it's not pro-Hillary, it's not anti-Trump, it's not anti-Hillary, it is apathy. It is a feeling that no matter what you do, Washington does not matter to you. That is the most dangerous thing that can exist in the world's only superpower, is the majority of the people increasingly don't care. And that's a much longer and harder fix than changing the Electoral College, where there's already legislation in process and it probably will be moved.
We have a queue forming with the questions. Next gentleman, please.
你好，我是来自中国的，我是专门从事领袖的教育培训，然后我对各国的领导人这几年演讲非常的怎么说呢，收获很大。刚刚我看到我们台上的嘉宾讲了关于这个各国的和平啊。
Very beneficial for each country, and to bring world peace, it is also important. Education is always important to eliminate wars and to get to a peace world or a world of peace. How can we cooperate? Because war is a big threat. It's a big threat for the development of humankind. How do leaders in the world or the first ministers of each countries, how can we awaken?
I'm honestly less worried about war. Truly, I'm much more worried about leaving people behind. I'm more worried about non-state actors becoming more powerful threats. Terrorist organizations, cyber crimes, this sort of thing. Look, I know that we talk a lot about terrorism, the Chinese, the Americans, the Europeans, and yet overwhelmingly our fix has been military. And you're going to see more of that under Trump than you did under Obama. Now, I get that bombing the hell out of ISIS is probably part of the solution, but if you think that that's a way that you're going to create fewer disenfranchised young Arab men that feel like their only alternative is violence, you're crazy. So, I mean, until we start addressing the fundamental issues of civil society, education, governance on the ground, you know, and start making a difference for these people, it's going to get worse. This is why I'm so depressed about the Syria situation. You know, the United States, my country, China, your country, Japan, 3 largest economies in the world. We look at Syria, 5.5 years, half of their population displaced, and we say, you know what? Not our problem. They can't swim here. No big deal, right? That's true. I mean, we were delighted. Merkel said, I'll take 1 million. Obama said, that is awesome, right? It's great that Merkel took 1 million. I don't know what, doesn't mean we're going to do anything. Like, if China and the U.S. doesn't care, if we think it's fundamentally someone else's problem, as we do, we can accept that, right? But we do have to understand there will be consequences, and those consequences will be unattractive to the question and answer that you and I just had.
我觉得哈，军队无法解决和平，宗教也有冲突。我觉得唯一可以解决和平的，就是让这个世界充满爱，这种爱的唤醒，才能让世界变得和平。我觉得这个放下哈，是那个唯一让人类觉醒，让放下人类的头脑欲望。
Promoting love is very important, and decreasing the private wishes of each country is also very important. This is my personal opinion. Thank you very much.
Look, the all we need is love approach worked beautifully for the Beatles. And it's certainly better than anything I've heard from anyone else here, so I'm prepared to accept that. And I think with that, I know we're running out of time here.
Probably
we have
time
one more?
Question,
okay, we have one more. It seemed like a nice way to end, you know, on an upbeat note.
We've got time for one last question, ladies and gentlemen. Is there one more question that we'd like to pose to Ian Bremmer? Maybe, Ian, if I could, we have a gentleman coming down. Yes, please. Yeah, please come through. Thank you.
Hi. Hate to ask the last question because it's supposed to be a good one, but that never happens. But I was wondering, so a lot of the expectation of what the Trump government would be like had to do with the uncertainty and all, with who he would surround himself with. And he's starting to name people now. So could you give us your impression of who he is surrounding himself with and what that might mean for the rest of the world?
Ian, we've got about 10 minutes, so we've got time to...
Oh, we do?
Yeah, you don't have to keep it short.
Okay, that's fine. Look, I would say, clearly, you're talking about so far a lot of people that are political outsiders. The most important advisor to Donald Trump is his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. He's been sort of in charge of, you know, sort of both substantive policy decisions so far, as well as kind of the transition team. He's got no political experience. You saw the appointment of Steve Bannon as chief strategist. Also, no political experience, limited from the national security people that they've appointed so far. If the Secretary of State is someone like Mitt Romney, it's very clear that a lot of people around the world will feel more comfortable. On the economic side, I would say that more of the advisors to Trump that we've seen over the past months have been people close to industry and also that have experience with the Republican establishment. So on the domestic economic side, I think that you're more likely to see a reversion to the mean. Not in rhetoric, but in practice. But on foreign policy and on identity politics, I think this is really a sea change from what you've had in the United States for decades. And the one place I would really point to, which we talked about a bit on the panel on connectivity earlier, is I can see a Trump administration that can play ball with the banks. I can see a Trump administration that can play ball with the multinational companies. I have a hard time seeing a Trump administration that can play ball with Silicon Valley. You guys all know that, you know, California was 61% Hillary. But when you look at the companies that were, you know, the Facebooks and the Googles, right? These companies, Twitter, these were companies that were critical to Trump winning because Trump's ability to leverage social media and fake news to promulgate his message was unprecedented in United States communications. Now, all of those companies now see that they need to do something. They need to get more assertive about owning that space. and undermining the message that was promulgated by the White House, where clearly the chief strategist, Steve Bannon, is directly opposed to that. So I think that you're going to see over the coming months a serious fight, both publicly and behind the scenes, between some of the companies that have been most important in driving the American Fourth Industrial Revolution and what Trump wants to accomplish. And it's less about economics. It's more about the narrative. It's more about who is telling the truth about what America is actually going through. Who determines who's a winner and a loser? Who's determined who is villainized if things don't go well? The singular most disturbing thing that I've seen in the last week since Trump was elected was his continued willingness to use Twitter and his media statements to go after people, organizations that he doesn't like. And I think that when we see that, we see that in other countries, but we haven't seen that in America. I suspect that's going to create a real division with some of the companies that are most important in pursuing globalization for the United States. And how that plays out, at this point, we don't know.
Can I take some more questions from the floor, please? Please put up your hands. Yes, we have a gentleman there.
You are apparently stuck with me for longer than you thought, but I am okay with that.
总统先生您好，我来自中国北京华湾控股集团。我的问题很简单，中国中小型企业去贵国投资的话，有哪些实际的政策支持呢？
in China, how do they do to invest in the U.S.?
谢谢。
I think the question of U.S.-China trade relations is going to be interesting. My view of trade from China to the U.S. in the 2008 financial crisis, suddenly Chinese, for about a year, didn't know that they believed in the U.S. economy anymore. And they were talking about diversifying away from the dollar. Look at Lehman Brothers, look at Madoff. The American free market wasn't good anymore. That would have been a disaster. You do not want to unwind the mutual economic destruction that exists between the U.S. and China. That helps keep the countries more stable and together. Ultimately, we got through that because the American economy started picking up again. It was a driver of growth, not as much as China was. The Chinese recognized we still want the dollar. We still want to work with the Americans. But what worries me is that you could potentially expand CFIUS legislation and say, we don't want the Chinese investing in a whole bunch of sectors that could potentially be defined as national security relevant. The way that the U.S. and China succeeds is if the American economy is so critical to China that the U.S. becomes too big to fail. Right? That's what you want. And I still think today that that's true. But if U.S.-China relations become more challenging, there's a legitimate national security interest. There are places where the Americans are going to say, we don't want Huawei because it's close to the People's Liberation Army. Or we don't want you buying this thing because it's used for the military. But if that gets defined broadly, so much so that the Chinese no longer see the U.S. as an attractive market to invest in, then you start seeing the U.S. actually in decline. That is not the case now, but certainly I'd like to believe that if you have the private sector advising Trump on what are the third rails he really doesn't want to touch, that would be one. China's responsible for 38% of the world's growth right now. The Peruvians know this. The Brazilians know this. The Chileans know this. The Colombians know this. It is not clear to me the Americans are suitably aware of this. It's not clear to me Trump is suitably aware of this. Ultimately, I will tell you, I'm more optimistic about this one. I don't believe that Trump is really going to go ahead and say, they're a currency manipulator, we're going to put massive tariffs on China. I think that Congress, Republican Congress, and also private sector interests are suitably strong to stop that from happening. But certainly this is a bigger risk than it was under the Obama administration.
I have a question. My name is Cecilia Lozada, and I'm from Peru. You're arguing that the states and the Trump administration is going to go towards a unilateral approach in politics. what do you think is going to happen to actually the institutionality and institutions that are supranational, like the UN? Do you think that that's going to have an impact? Probably it is. So are we seeing a system where these institutions that represent many countries are going doomed? What is your perspective about that?
So in a world where you don't have global leadership, it's hard to have US-led global institutions. These institutions you're talking about, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, they are global, but they were created by the US, and they follow traditional American values. Now, the Trump perspective is that multilateralism actually constrains America. Multilateralism puts burdens on America, allows other countries to free ride. You even see that with NATO, never mind the UN. Now, we don't know if John Bolton is going to be Secretary of State, though he's in the running. Now, this is the guy that said that you could take 8 floors off the United Nations and not notice, right? Look, I mean, I'm a big fan of the new UN SecGen, Antonio Gutierrez. I actually had him for dinner, literally at my house, the day after the election. And it was meant to be kind of a celebration of, let's introduce you to the private sector and all the things that can be done to make the UN work, since Ban Ki-moon was not a strong leader, right? And of course, Trump won. Now, if you're running the UN right now, you have to be worried about US support for your budget. You have to be worried about US support on climate. You have to be worried even about US support on things like gender relations and human rights. How about the International Criminal Court, right? I mean, that's moving in the other direction. So clearly, multilateralism and multilateral institutions, if they're global, are going to get weaker. But other institutions that are international but are narrower, that are more fit for purpose, some of which will be led by other countries around the world, on trade, on humanitarian issues, non-governmental actors on issues like refugees, the Catholic Church, look at the Pope, other untraditional institutions will help to fill that gap. Facebook will help to fill that gap. I mean, we are ingenious people, the human creatures, and when things don't work in one place, we stop hitting our head against the same wall. We go find something else. If Washington proves broken for multilateralism, we will find other places to get multilateralism done. We must not allow the great to be the enemy of the good. If we can't do global, we must find other ways. By the way, the Paris Accord, everyone talked about how amazing the Paris Accord was. That wasn't because the heads of state suddenly had an epiphany. That was because mayors and Jack Ma and Bill Gates and Mike Bloomberg said the governments aren't doing it. We need to play more of a role. It was precisely the failures of central governments in Cancun and Durban and Copenhagen that finally unlocked the ingenuity of human beings who said, enough. We're sick of not paying attention to this. We see what's happening. We're going to do something. And will there be a backlash from globalists to Trump who say, enough, we'll find other ways of doing this? City mayors, universities, California, non-state actors, that's going to happen. So I'm not sitting here at all telling you this is just 4 years of disaster. I don't believe that.
Thank you. Next question.
尊敬的总裁先生，你好，我来自中国河北星洲电缆有限公司。我想问您一下，就是关于美国这次大选。其实我在中国有了解到，就是中国义乌一个小商品交易市场。当时在大选结果出来之前，我感觉到就是市场上，其实川普的这个纪念品要比希拉里要多得多。我想说一个问题，就是总裁先生，您肯定是美国的精英阶层。这次我们感觉到就是美国的平民阶层战胜了精英阶层。我想就是说这个问题是不是代表现在美国的这个平民阶层和这个精英阶层已经脱节得很厉害？ 甚至一些媒体全部都在，就是大选结果出来之前都以为是希拉里肯定会当选，但是社会上包括中国的一些平民这些小商品，可能看得出来是川普可能更占优势。这样，我想，总裁先生，您就是说这个是不是一种脱节美国的这个环境？是这样。
This is why there's a gap here, do you think, between these two social classes?
There's no question that Donald Trump appealed to the same impulses that you saw with Brexit. There were a large number of Americans that said corporates, banks, public intellectuals, the media, and the Democratic and Republican establishment, no good for me. I was watching the same things you were. His ability, Trump's ability, he had the same number of Twitter followers as Hillary, but he had 10 times more impressions from those tweets. Not only because he was using it masterfully, but also because those images were resonating. When people feel like the government's no good for them, even if you don't have a good answer, they'll do something. They'll throw a rock. For me, I thought that the Trump election was like a Palestinian with a rock. When you've been around for decades and the Israelis tell you peace process and the Palestinian Authority tells you peace process and the Europeans say we'll put sanctions on until we get a peace process and the Americans say we're going to work for a two-state solution, it's going to happen for you, and the UN says we'll make a difference. By 2016, you are sick of this. You don't believe anyone. So you're sitting there, and there's an Israeli soldier, and there's a rock, and you pick it up and you throw it. Now, you don't think that rock is going to help you. But it gives you voice. It gives you agency. There is nothing that Trump has said that makes me believe that suddenly these disenfranchised Americans are going to have milk and honey in the United States. And I don't think they believe it either. But they believe that Trump represented one voice, someone who finally identified their pain, said it is okay for you to be angry. I get you. And he didn't get a lot of votes. He got less than Romney. Again, most Americans didn't care. But Trump got a lot more votes than anyone thought he would get, including me. Right? He surprised everybody, surprised all the polls. Why? Because people wanted a rock. Now they've thrown it. The thing is, if you're a Palestinian with the rock, you run away. Because the rock doesn't help you, you don't want to get arrested. Well, unfortunately, the dispossessed in the United States have no place to run. And so I suspect you're going to see a lot more anger in America. And the danger domestically is if Trump does not get the economy going for them, he's going to need to demonize. I was there at the Republican convention in Cleveland. That was the angriest, most demagogic speech I'd ever seen from a presidential nominee about how America is horrible, how blacks have no other chance, how we've got to do something. His ability and willingness to divide the country if he fails, if people criticize him, is high. So I do agree with Obama in a fundamental way. We all need Trump to succeed, because the alternative is worse. The problem is we now all have to prepare for what happens if Trump fails, because that is a very real possibility. This is no longer put your head in the sand time. A small story, yeah, I guess I have time for a small story here for them. The average American wasn't having those conversations. It was irrelevant. What Trump will do in the United States is he's going to make politics much more real for a lot of Americans. And again, frankly, that's on balance a positive thing.
And on that note, thank you very much, Mr. Ian Bremmer. Would you please give him a very warm round of applause? Thank you. That was a spirited discussion. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Please do stay in your seats. We have the President of Vietnam. He is here in the building, and we are going to bring him on stage in about 1 minute. And this is going to be the handover to the chairmanship for the APEC CEO Summit, where Vietnam will be hosting the APEC CEO Summit, the APEC Leaders Week in Da Nang of Vietnam next year. So please do stay in your seats. We will have the final session with the President of Vietnam in about 2 minutes. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted to invite to the stage Mr. Alfonso Bustamante, the chairman of the APEC CEO Summit 2016, Mr. Vu Chien Loc, the chairman of the Vietnam Chamber of Commerce and Industry and the chairman of the APEC CEO Summit 2017. And would you please give a very warm welcome to President Tran Dai Quang, the President of Vietnam.
Well, they say all good things come to an end, and we're coming to an end of our intense couple of days, which I sincerely hope that we have succeeded putting Peru in the spotlight here. So now I want to introduce 2017 APEC leaders, and we're going to show a video that summarizes our meeting. Please, the video. well, quality growth and human development is sure something that matters. We have managed to do this beautiful presentations and manage this couple of days due to the effort of some very special people. This is the COMEX team led by Jessica Luna. Please stand up, Jessica. And come up here. Come on.
I also want to invite Luciano Paredes, coordinator of the CEO Summit 2016.
These two guys have led this impressive movement of people. It hasn't been easy, and they have made my work very easy. So thank you very much. I want to acknowledge you this, and I offer already in advance your help to 2017 CEO Chair, Mr. Wu Ting-Lok, whom I want to present here. Please stand up, Mr. Chairman. And we hope he is as lucky as I have been to have such a wonderful team. Please, can I have the... Since 2011, we had the initiative of the United States to present the CEO Summit Chair with a gavel, the gavel of the chair. This gavel represents justice and liberty. So I want to give you this and make the best out of justice, liberty, and do the best for your country. Thank you.
His Excellency President Trần Đại Quang, His Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for very successful the CEO Summit 2006 in Peru. And on behalf of Vietnam business community, I'd like to invite all of you to come to Vietnam next year. And we try our best to organize successful the CEO Summit 2007. And now I would like to invite His Excellency President Trần Đại Quang will give a speech. Thank you.
Thưa quý vị và các bạn,
Ladies and gentlemen,
hôm nay
today
tôi rất vui mừng
I am very
cùng
pleased
quý vị và các
to
bạn
join you
tham dự hội nghị
in the
thượng đỉnh
APEC
doanh nghiệp
CEO
APEC
Summit
được tổ chức
held
đúng
on
vào
the
dịp kỷ niệm
occasion
20 năm
of its
thành lập.
20th anniversary.
Tôi hoan nghênh
I
và
welcome
đánh giá cao
and hold in high
nỗ lực của
regard
Hiệp hội Thương
the
mại Quốc
efforts
tế
of the
Peru
Peruvian Foreign Trade
tổ
Association
chức sự kiện
in
quan trọng
hosting
này.
this very important event.
Những vấn đề
The
được thảo
issues
luận
we
tại hội
have
nghị
discussed at this
có ý
meeting
nghĩa thiết thực
are
đối với
especially
kinh tế khu
meaningful
vực
to the
và
regional
thế giới.
and global economy.
Nhiều đề xuất của các
Your
bạn
many
là cơ
recommendations
sở quan
will
trọng
be an important
để các nhà
foundation
lãnh
for
đạo
APEC
cân nhắc
leaders to
quyết
consider
định
and in
hướng đi của APEC
deciding the
trong
forum's
thời gian
future
sắp
direction.
tới.
On this occasion, I would like to congratulate the APEC business community on your outstanding successes and indispensable contribution over the past years. You are the pioneers who have initiated and realized many ideas for growth, cooperation, and connectivity within the APEC Forum, as well as Asia-Pacific as a whole. Ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about the future, we cannot help but elaborate on the challenges that lie ahead of us. This year marks the 5th consecutive year the global economy has grown below the average rate of 3%. The first time after so many years, APEC's average growth is slowing down in comparison to the rest of the world. Global trade is at the lowest level in 15 years. There are even concerns that the reversal of globalization may occur for the first time in the 21st century. Our region remains the hotbed of climate change. This has inflicted major damages to economies as well as the operation of businesses. Within the last decade alone, natural disasters have caused more than 500,000 deaths, affected the life of 1.4 billion people, accounting for 80% of all climate change victims over the world. In addition, armed conflict, international terrorism, epidemics, cybersecurity, resource security, especially water, food, and energy security, the development gap, the migration issue, among many others. They are creating unprecedented challenges to global efforts, to economic recovery, sustainable social and economic development. In such a globalized world full of uncertainties, more than ever, APEC needs to reaffirm its role as an incubator of ideas and a driver for innovation, economic growth, and integration. In that spirit, Vietnam proposes the theme of creating new dynamism, fostering a shared future for APEC 2017. It is high time we join hands and work together to create a new dynamism and revitalize trade and investment. This is a driver for sustainable and inclusive development and equitable growth in the interest of our people. We must remain focused on fulfilling the BOGO goals by 2020, creating an open business and investment environment, and continuing to reinforce the multilateral trading system. The fourth industrial revolution, along with a strong global commitment to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, creating a new driver for quality growth. The focus of the upcoming years must be on accelerating economic restructuring towards sustainability, inclusiveness, and equity. Priority should be given to increasing productivity, ensuring food, resource security, especially water and clean energy, developing high-quality human resources, strengthening competitiveness and creativity for businesses, especially micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. Breakthroughs and extensive economic linkages within the region are rapidly taking shape. Most notable are the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, the ASEAN Community, among many others. This trend promises to bring about a vast development space with new prospects for cooperation. Therefore, we need to strengthen connectivity in all three areas: infrastructure, institution, and people. Developing global value chains, promoting cooperation in economic, trade and investment, services, tourism, and others, with a view to enhancing the resilience of our economies. All of these drivers are the basis for us to overcome challenges and build a bright future together. This future lies in building an APEC for the people, for businesses, contributing to maintaining the Asia-Pacific as a driver for global growth and connectivity. Ladies and gentlemen, after 30 years of reform, Vietnam has gained enormous achievements. We have transformed from a less developed country into a middle-income developing country. Vietnam today is one of the most rapidly growing markets and is projected to become one of the 5 most competitive manufacturing nations in the Asia-Pacific by 2020. We have been able to maintain the momentum for economic recovery and achieve a growth rate of 6.7% in 2015, the highest since 2011. It is expected that Vietnam will remain one of the 10 fastest growing economies in the upcoming years. We are aiming for the goal of an average growth rate of 6.5 to 7% in 2020. To that end, we are determined to undertake 3 major strategic breakthroughs. These are improving the market economy institutions, promoting human resources development, especially high-quality human resources, and developing modern infrastructure that is comprehensive. In addition, we are committed to transforming the growth model, developing a knowledge economy, especially high-tech industries, and modernizing agriculture, supporting industries, the maritime economy, and the tourism industry. We are making efforts to build a law-governed state, transparent and efficient in the interest of the people and businesses. We seek to improve the legal institutions and policies, protect the environment, expand the business space for stakeholders, awaken all potential for businesses, promote accountability, uphold the rule of law, and create new drivers for social and economic development. As one of the dynamic economies with a high level of openness and the destination of many multinational corporations, Vietnam is becoming ever more integrated with the 2 sides of the Pacific through different partnerships. The ASEAN community, as well as a network of 16 FTAs, with 59 partners, including 18 APEC member economies. Effective cooperation of APEC businesses in Vietnam, as well as Vietnamese businesses working in APEC economies, stand testimony to this linkage. Worth mentioning is the success of Viettel, the leading telecommunication company in Vietnam, working in Peru. We always treasure the support and partnership of the APEC business community throughout the 30 years of reform and 20 years of Vietnam's membership in the APEC Forum. Your invaluable support has provided us with an enormous encouragement for the 2006 APEC year held in the first time in Vietnam, culminating in its many meaningful results. Today, here you are, to look forward to a 2017 APEC year that promises new landmark achievements. Through APEC's activities, especially the APEC CEO Summit, I call upon your ideas and initiatives to specify the priorities of the APEC 2017 year and to promote interaction between governments and businesses. We also look forward to your ideas in furthering the efforts to accomplish the Borgo goals by 2020 and realize APEC's strategies, roadmaps, and action plan more effectively. Accordingly, We need to continue to promote sustainable and inclusive growth, deepen regional economic integration, build capacity, and promote innovation for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, and ensuring food security and sustainable agriculture. These are vital issues for APEC in the upcoming years. Ladies and gentlemen, APEC is entering its fourth decade of development. APEC's future and shared destiny depends on the vision of member economies as well as the business community. That is why we need to start a process of reflection to create a new vision for APEC post-2020 and continue to uphold APEC's role as the leading mechanism for regional economic integration in the new period. The Vietnamese state and people look forward to meeting you and greeting you in our beautiful coastal city of Da Nang next November. New opportunities and enormous potentials for cooperation lie ahead of us. Thank you very much.
This video is showing beautiful Vietnam.
And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, please, another round of applause for President of Vietnam, our incoming chair for the APEC CEO Summit, Dr. Vu Tien Loc, and also a very big round of applause for Mr. Bustamante for his leadership of the APEC CEO Summit 2016. And a big thank you to all of you for joining us here in Lima, Peru, the APEC CEO Summit. And we look forward to seeing you next year from the 8th to the 10th of November 2017 in Da Nang, Vietnam. Thank you very much.
El equipo de Convex Perú y Stimulus, por favor, acercarse al escenario.